cup, and we can...
Yeah, we can just leave it the way it is.
Yeah. Then I cup.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, especially in a very busy time with prelims. Really appreciate everyone coming out here. First item, very important day in politics. Anyone know why? Yes. What states are up for primaries? Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Really cool ones. Really interesting results. Probably shouldn't be finished coming out until later in the evening. So do stay tuned with that afterwards. For those of you that are new to Cornell Political Union meetings, just a rundown of how our structure works. We're going to go ahead and first begin with our guest speaker, who's going to present their argument for anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes. Afterwards, we then will entertain a brief question and answer period. And at that point, feel free to ask him about his arguments or also his experience, any other questions regarding politics that you might have. And then after that, we'll open it up to our main portion, which is the student discussion. So we really encourage everyone, regardless of political orientation, to speak up, state your mind if you agree, disagree, if you have questions, anything. We really want this to be a conducive space for everyone to share their thoughts. And then finally, we will conclude with a vote on whether or not we agree or disagree with Mr. Lopina's statement. So, tonight's topic question is, should lobbying be banned from U.S. politics? Lobbying is understood as political activity by paid professionals, or generally attorneys, that influence key legislation and executive decisions. It is protected as a form of free speech, and lobbying has been around since the founding of the United States, and is present in every single level of government, from local authorities all the way to top federal branches in D.C. The topic of lobbying, as you guys probably know, has become rather controversial, as many view it as a method of allowing big money to influence politics. So, does political lobbying do more good than harm? Tonight, our guest speaker, Brian Lopina, he's a well-known lobbyist from Washington, D.C., and he will be arguing that lobbyists are an essential part of the public policy process. However, a ban on campaign contributions by and through lobbyists is a much-needed reform. Mr. Lopina has been involved in the public policy process for over 30 years. He has worked for 3 members of Congress, including serving as Chief of Staff and Legislative Director. Mr. Lopina later served as presidential appointee during the Reagan Administration in 3 agencies. He was responsible for public building issues with the General Service Administration Office of Congressional Affairs, was Director of Interagency Affairs at the Department of Education, and was a grant manager at the Department of Transportation. In addition, throughout his career, Mr. Lopina has worked as a prominent grassroots organizer and a lobbyist partner for his own firm. So, tonight it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Brian Lopina.
All right, well, it's great to be here at Cornell, and I thank you so much. I think just the whole idea of having a political union like this is fantastic, so I congratulate all of you. Let me just set my timer here. Okay. Well, it's interesting here. The subject you're going to be voting on is whether lobbying should be banned, and here I am, a lobbyist. I find it interesting that you've selected a room where people can throw things down. That's very strategic, I'm sure. But, some say lobbying is a disreputable profession. Some say it's the world's oldest profession, tracing its roots back to when the devil lobbied Eve to eat the apple, or perhaps when Eve lobbied Adam to eat the apple. But I say otherwise. So, as Fernando said, I've been on all 3 sides of lobbying, if you will. I've seen it as a congressional staffer, receiving lobbyists. I've seen it working the executive branch, dealing with lobbyists, and as a lobbyist myself. So I'll make several points here. First of all, the framers knew that lobbying was essential to freedom. Now, the framers didn't call it lobbying. They called it petitioning the government. And it's the same thing whether you petition yourself or you hire a professional to do it. They not only knew that this was a valuable right that needed to be protected, they knew from firsthand experience the harm that was caused when the opposite happens, when you restrict the ability to petition the government. The Declaration of Independence does not mince words in this regard. I will quote, "In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people." They also felt so strongly about this that they enshrined it in the Constitution. Now, we all know the First Amendment guarantees the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of press, often overlooked. It also protects, quote, "the right to petition the government for redress of grievances," end quote. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that your right to petition the government includes your right to hire a professional lobbyist to represent you. At the same time, the framers knew that the dangers of factions, i.e. lobbying on behalf of competing interests, could pose when it gets out of hand. James Madison in Federalist Paper number 10 defined a faction as, quote, "a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or a majority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of the citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community," end quote. Sure does sound to me like a definition of lobbying that can get out of hand. So they did as best as they could to also enshrine in the Constitution the myriad of checks and balances of which I'm sure you're familiar. These are to not only protect the excesses of lawmakers, but also protect the excesses of petitioning the government. And that is the key there, that phrase, "as best they could," because it is unfair to restrict access to government, and really, as a practical matter, impossible to create perfect rules to prevent its excesses. Now, regardless of the Constitution, just as a matter of fairness, the government should not deprive a person or an entity from making their voice heard in the most effective way they believe is the most effective. In modern times, you have to hire a lobbyist because the government is simply too complicated for the average person to do it him or herself. The government has gotten so vastly complicated today that the merchant can't simply stroll in to meet with his delegate in the Virginia House of Burgesses as he could in 1680 and say, "Can you help me out here?" I'm going to give you an example of what this means from my own lobbying career. I represented a client called Active Release Techniques, or ART. For those of you who have had massage therapy, it's a very popular type of it. The Occupation Safety and Health Administration ruled we're going to put him out of business because it said what he was really doing is not massage therapy, but a chiropractic practice. So my colleagues at the law firm and I analyzed the law, analyzed the regs, really had it down cold that they had simply misapplied the law, and because they didn't want to save face or lose face, they were just going to let this guy go high and dry. Now, what was he supposed to do when some bureaucrat just gave him the wrong answer? He didn't know if there was an appeal process, who to appeal to. He didn't know how the agency worked. He didn't know what the law said. He didn't have any relationship with decision makers. He was dead in the water without hiring either a lawyer or a lobbyist. And a lobbyist is a lot less expensive than hiring a lawyer to file a lawsuit. Take another analogy here. Say a restaurateur wants to start a restaurant. This illustrates the complexity and the requirement to hire professionals. Someone who opens up a restaurant is a good cook, he's got a theme for what he wants to do, hopefully he hires good people. He's in the restaurant business, but he's got to hire a lawyer to help with vendor contracts with the corporation. He's got to hire an accountant to deal with taxes. He hires a PR firm to generate press coverage and social media for the grand opening. And so lobbying is just another service professionals for those who know the government is complex and need some help navigating the way. So, if you have a negative opinion about lobbyists, I will tell you, you'll feel entirely different if you're the one being screwed by the government like that company I just told you about that I represented. So with this context, first let's explore a little bit of what a lobbyist actually does. Number one, educate. Issues and bills are way too complicated for the average legislator. Sometimes they run hundreds of pages, contains all sorts of gremlins and unintended consequences. All this takes place in a high-pressure environment with too little time for legislators and their overworked staff to adequately understand what all the issues and sub-issues are about from both sides, how they impact the district or state, who is weighing in on these issues, where the subcommittee chairman, the full committee chairman, the leadership of the party, of their own party, and the other chambers stand on them. So because of the sheer complexity of the process and the multiplicity of issues, lobbyists, whether you like them or not, have nonetheless become an essential part of the policy-making process. Second, lobbyists actually add value to the legislative process. If the lobbyist is trustworthy, more on that later, and the lobbyist is prepared, the lobbyist answers many essential questions and adds tangible value in several ways, such as knowing his or her side of the issue down cold, having data to back up the assertions made, distilling the elements in layman's terms into concise, cogent arguments, knowing the other side's arguments, being prepared to present them, and then explain why your position is the superior one. Have intelligence on the positions of the committee, the leadership, the other chamber, know the impact on constituents, identify and present the names of the constituent interests that support your position, and if the lobbyist is asking the legislator to do something like sponsoring a bill or offering an amendment, they offer to help do that through drafting legislation, drafting talking points, developing a legislative strategy and an action plan, developing a coalition of other supporters, developing constituent support, developing support among other legislators by lobbying them, having relationships with those legislators so they will hear you out, and finally, doing what you promise. Now you can imagine how valuable this would be in a different context. I'm going to try to relate it to you. You will all be looking for a job before you know it. Let's say you found out that Company X has a job opening that appears just right for you, and you happen to know why someone you trust works there. Why becomes, in effect, your lobbyist. Why is very helpful to you. Why tells you what it's really like to work there, regardless of what the job description says on paper, what the job is really all about company morale, about what the coworkers are like, what the boss is like to work for, and since Y knows the boss, Y offers to personally hand your resume to the boss and give you a strong recommendation. That's lobbying. Now here's a key point. Don't conflate the dysfunctionality of the legislative process with the value of an ethical lobbyist. There's an old saying that the legislative process is like making sausage. You don't want to know how it's made. Or as Winston Churchill put it, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. So there are many examples of abuse of power in Congress and the executive branch. That is a reality, and it's getting worse all the time, I will tell you. But because of this, an ethical lobbyist is actually more important to the client to help navigate the swamp. Moreover, in most cases, lobbyists even help to break legislative gridlock. In most cases, lobbyists hate gridlock because they don't win with gridlock. Lobbyists, more than legislators, have better bipartisan relationships with the other party and the other chamber. In some cases, lobbyists are the best ones who can overcome an impasse by shaping and building consensus on positions that accommodate competing interests. Now, let's look at common sense, in particular, self-interest, a great way to analyze this issue. An unethical lobbyist is simply an ineffective lobbyist. Legislators are motivated not to deal with unethical lobbyists out of self-interest. They don't want to be thrown in jail because of a scandal. They don't want to lose an election. Logically, then, they want to stay away from those with a sleazy reputation, just as you would in some other context. In real life, a lobbyist's reputation is right on the table, front and center. You're asking a legislator to trust what you are saying is accurate, and you have data to back it up. You burn them once, and your reputation is burned. Lobbyists have a vested interest in maintaining a good reputation. Now, you know the importance of trust and reputation instinctively. Let's say that you're going to buy a car. You don't trust salesmen, car salesmen, so you go online, you do research, what a fair price is, you shop around, and then you pick a salesman who you believe is the most honest and fair that you can find. If you have a good positive experience, the next time you're ready to buy a car, you're going to go back to the same person. It's no different in lobbying. A legislator should be and is skeptical about a lobbyist he or she meets for the first time. After getting input from multiple sources to verify what the lobbyist is saying is true, he or she is more inclined to listen to that lobbyist the next time around if they've been straight with him. Reputable lobbying is also backed up by empirical data. A group called the Policy Council surveyed 273 congressional staff and asked what the best lobbyists do. The top attribute at 86% was consistently providing reliable information. Now, the biggest myth about lobbying is that legislators vote the way the lobbyist asks based on friendship, that's who you know, or because of the legislator owes the lobbyist for campaign contributions. But I would ask you to think about this again logically in 6 different ways. 1, it would stick out like a sore thumb for a legislator to all of a sudden cast a vote that was out of character with the legislator's voting pattern. Say a Republican who consistently votes for business against unions, all of a sudden casts a union vote, or vice versa. The press would be all over that. And when was the last time you read a story about that happening? We haven't. What actually happens is the exact opposite. A lobbyist shapes the argument into a pre-existing pattern, into the pre-existing pattern of the legislator's voting record and his public policy views, and shows how what the lobbyist is asking can be consistent with this. But sometimes it just doesn't work. So if the lobbyist believes that there just isn't a fit, you don't lobby the person, because it would be a waste of your time. And you instinctively know this too, because I would probably say, because my kids were that way with me when they were in high school, you became pretty persistent lobbyists of your parents when you were in high school. You honed your lobbying skills to match your parents' worldviews. Dad, you keep telling me I have to act more responsible now that I'm a teenager, but you won't give me the opportunity to show it. Let me stay out past midnight and you'll see I won't come back home drunk or wreck the car. Now, if you didn't think that would fly, you just suck it up and be home by midnight. Mom, I know that Mad Max is rated A for violence, but I know it's only a video game, and you know I'm not violent. It's not like I beat up kids at school. Now, if you didn't think that would fly, you'd simply buy another Call of Duty rated M. 2, competition in the marketplace is a powerful force against hiring sleaze. There are thousands of lobbyists you can hire. Why would a client hire one who's sleazy? If they're sleazy with legislators, they're apt to be sleazy with you, the client. 3, competition among lobbyists for a legislator's attention is a powerful force against listening to sleaze. Legislators and staff are incredibly busy and overwhelmed. Why spend any time with someone who has a sleazy reputation and take a risk? If you need information about some topic, there are plenty of other options to pick from. 4, lobbying has a bad reputation because the bad apples in every profession always make the news. The vast majority that behave properly just aren't newsworthy. There are 535 members of Congress and about 12,000 registered lobbyists. Add up the number of legislators and lobbyists that you've heard about who were involved in scandals. It's only a handful of that number. Again, you instinctively know this. You always read about the latest female teacher who had sex with some student, but how many of you actually know this has ever happened? 5, lobbying has a bad reputation because Hollywood simply can't resist and loves the bad stereotype. Money, sex, and drugs sell. The lesson here, do not base your opinions on House of Cards. Base it on hard news and evidence. Hollywood is not reality. 6, lobbying reforms and the criminal penalties that go along with them have had a major impact on cleaning up the profession where at one time, admittedly, sleaze was the norm. As avenues of corruption have been shut down through these reforms, the sleazy lobbyists who relied on them left because they had nothing to fall back on but their sleaze, and because a sleazy reputation cannot be rehabilitated. And case number one is Jack Abramoff, you may have read about, somebody that I actually knew. And a friend of mine at the law firm I was with said years before he was caught, you know, some guy that guy's going to wind up in jail, and he eventually did wind up in jail. So there are 5 key reforms that have been implemented over time that have vastly improved the profession. Number one, transparency on who the client is and the amounts paid to lobbyists. You have to register for your client, how much you're getting paid, who you're lobbying, and what the issues are. That's for everyone to see online. This wasn't always the case. There's a tremendous book by Robert Caro about biographies, several of them, of Lyndon Baines John, President Johnson. And back when he was a congressman, he had one of his aides, a guy named John Connally, actually ended up being governor of Texas, secretary of the Treasury, and ran for president. But Connally was just a staffer at the time, and he would say, John, take that empty suitcase over there, hop on an airplane, go back to Texas, meet with all my oil and gas buddies, load up that suitcase full of bills, cash, bring it back here, we'll put it in the safe. So he was literally a madman. And LBJ would have that little kitty of money to hand out his favors. Second reform, the gift ban. You can't do any wining and dining anymore. If you do, you can get thrown in jail, just like Jack Abramoff. That's where he tripped up, amongst other things, as well as staffers. I'll get to staffers in a minute. Robert Caro, again, talks about life as a lobbyist in the 1950s when Johnson was a senator. And basically, cash, booze, and prostitutes were kind of common. I hate to say it. Third, honoraria. Honoraria is this ridiculous concept for a legislator where the idea is that you would pay a congressman to give a speech to some interest group. And the going rate used to be $10,000 for a committee chairman. The idea was, look, he's an expert in, say, he's the head of the tax committee. He's an expert in tax policy. If you were to get some other expert in tax policy, they'd be worth $10,000. So is the congressman. Wow. The conflict of interest is pretty apparent with that sort of an arrangement. So that has been banned long ago. The earmarks are gone. Another ban that has helped. There is no fifth one, there's no quid pro quo on campaign contributions. In other words, you can't give a campaign contribution in exchange for a vote. This has had a limited effect. More on that later. Moreover, staff indictments have had a huge chilling effect on sleaze. It has changed the culture for the better. There is an exception under the gift ban for just little trinkets. A baseball hat, a coffee mug, and a logo, that kind of thing that you want to hand out to the congressman or the senator. I tell clients, don't even give them trinkets because although completely legal, many staff now instinctively recoil at even taking trinkets because they don't want to get in trouble like others did before them. All of what Abramoff did in relation to lobbying was legal at some earlier point in time. He just never gave up the practice. He was also found guilty of misdeeds relating to how he dealt with his clients, but that's unrelated. Now, at this point, if you were thinking, okay, well, maybe Brian has made some good points of why someone can be an ethical lobbyist, but, most lobbyists are still sleazy. Well, let me address that. Here's the key reason why most lobbyists are not sleazy today. I'm going to repeat the earlier point I made. As avenues of corruption have been shut down, the sleazy lobbyists who relied on them left because they had nothing to fall back on and because the sleazy reputation cannot be rehabilitated. Now, let me talk about the bad part of lobbying that still needs to change. That's campaign contributions. While there is no quid pro quo, there is a clear conflict of interest and temptation for votes relating to campaign contributions. And indeed, while you never see or hear of anyone explicitly say, here's the money for the vote, in a fundraiser with lobbyists, issues are routinely discussed. It's become the norm. Now, there's a misperception that it buys votes. As previously stated, it doesn't buy votes. But it does buy a couple things. Not for all, but with some legislators. It buys access. The access is valued because a lobbyist has the ability to state his case, or her case, while others don't. Still, though, whatever happens in the way of the vote is going to be decided on the merits and on the constituent interest, because again, it would be out of character for all of a sudden this vote to appear out of nowhere that was inconsistent with the past voting record. It also can buy a prioritization of the legislator's to-do list. They only have a limited amount of time to lead on issues. So if you want to have that person introduce a bill, offer an amendment in committee, hold a hearing, etc., lobbying, campaign contributions can buy access to prioritization. Now, the reason that fundraising has become so pervasive is the cost of running campaigns is skyrocketing. The average cost of a House race is now $1.7 million. That has doubled in the last 10 years and doubled more than that, doubled again in the previous 12 years before that. Congressmen must now raise $2,300 a day for 2 years to meet that figure. So they've got fundraisers in Washington every month now. Lobbyists are bombarded with personal calls from legislators and staff calling during business hours, but, quote, on their free time. Outside the office, sometimes they literally just go on the sidewalk and they've got one cell phone here for business and one for the campaign. They take out the campaign one, they make the phone call. They want you to contribute personally, get your PAC to contribute, get your clients to contribute, and host a fundraiser for you. It's a mess. Lobbyists hate when you get up. And the congressmen and the senators hate asking for it. Everybody hates the darn system, but it just persists. And of course, this, besides all the conflicts of interest out there, it takes an extraordinary amount of time that should be spent legislating instead of fundraising. I stopped contributing years ago, and I'm very glad I did. So I would offer 3 necessary reforms that will clean up this aspect of it. 1, prohibit lobbyists from contributing or soliciting contributions. There's always a bill introduced to this effect. It never goes anywhere because the legislators don't want to turn off the spigot. 2, restrict campaign contributions to your home state or congressional district. So now you don't have the XYZ trade association based over here all of a sudden involved in this other race. 3rd, prohibit these independent super PACs that would fill the void. The likelihood of these reforms, first of all, this would be really hard to enact. The ban on lobbyist contributions has been out there for years, and there's a constitutional argument that that's part of free speech, so it might take a constitutional amendment to do some of this stuff. But, you know, these reforms are probably not likely to happen anytime soon, but maybe their time is coming. I've been very impressed with the groundswell of popular support against the system that both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have engendered. And this phenomenon may mean that we're near a tipping point of people just too darn fed up with the system, they're going to demand some changes. So I'm going to be a little optimistic and say maybe we can actually get somewhere on this last big piece of the puzzle that is so necessary in Washington. So where does all this leave us right now? In my opinion, we still have the best system, warts and all. Imperfect as it is, there's actually still a rough justice to the American political system. The people's voice is more or less heard and reflected over time. It would be easy to get disillusioned with all that I have told you today, but I haven't lost faith, and I don't think you should either. I still get chills when I walk up by the Capitol. I take your child to work day, which I've done for my 3 kids. I take them to I'd say the most important spot at Capitol. It's not the Capitol, it's not some statue, it's not the floor of the House or the Senate, it's the cafeteria. And I say it's the cafeteria because in our country, we have a rule of law. We don't kill people or throw them in prison because they don't disagree with the government. So you'll be sitting down having lunch, and there across there are some other lobbyists that you know is on the opposite side, and you give them a nod there, it gives you a nod, you're very cordial. And these can be issues, they can be life and death. They can be to go to war or not. They can be about, the death penalty. Huge, heavy issues. Businesses and things fall and rise on it. But we do it within the context of a representative democracy. I'm pretty proud of that. So I lobby on issues that I agree with, not that those that I disagree with, just to make a buck. I came to Washington to make a difference. I think I have, and I'm proud of it.
much for that. And we're right now going to open the floor up to some question and answer. And everyone feel free to ask not just only about the topic, but also if you want to know more about his experience in DC.
Okay, yes, sir.
My question is not so much on the ethical or the legal aspect of lobbying, but rather